Most people are wrong about what makes a story original. That's why, if you love Hunter x Hunter like I do, you're probably insulted by the mere suggestion that it's derivative. And I agree. Not all people see it that way. I've been thinking about this for almost a decade now, and it all started when an acquaintance of mine first saw Meruem. Their immediate reaction was to blurt out, "Hey, that's just Perfect Cell, what a ripoff," and proceeded to talk trash about it. Of course, I instantly got defensive, and an argument ensued, but I never really found a proper way to make my point. That is, until now. Because, let's be honest here, if Yoshihiro Togashi wanted to come up with a more unique design for Meruem, he was more than capable of doing it, which leads me to believe that copying Toriyama was a deliberate artistic choice. So, what was he trying to say with it? Well, to answer that question, we first have to explore the origins of the Nen system, and the underlying meaning behind it, because, in my opinion, understanding this is the key to what makes Hunter x Hunter original. Nen is, without doubt, one of the most unique aspects of Hunter x Hunter. People who read or watch the series tend to be amazed by how flexible and creative it is, but it didn't start in a vacuum. We can see Togashi began developing this magic system in his first hit series, Yu Yu Hakusho. In that story, spirit energy works more or less like Nen. You can emit it like a beam, enhance your body to make it stronger, and even conceal your presence by learning to control it. While used masterfully here, leading to amazing fights like Yusuke vs Toguro, it's not exactly groundbreaking since, well, it's just Dragon Ball Ki with a different coat of paint. This makes a lot of sense because Yu Yu Hakusho was being published alongside Dragon Ball while it was still in its prime. Everyone was imitating Dragon Ball because it was so cool and new. Togashi himself doesn't deny this. In fact, he idolizes Toriyama.
そうですね。まあ非常にありきたりですけど、神なので、天井人ですね。
The reason Yu Yu Hakusho started out as a comedy and then transitions into a battle manga is because that's exactly what Toriyama did in Dragon Ball, and Togashi wanted to emulate him. That said, after the Dark Tournament saga, Togashi seems to have realized how limiting this power system could be, since Yusuke was now the strongest being on the planet, and the only way to raise the stakes would be to introduce an opponent with even more spiritual energy, which would make the previous enemies look weaker by comparison, and therefore less significant. To put it simply, Togashi was worried about power creep because power levels are bullshit. In order to challenge his protagonist, Togashi needed a different approach for his fights, which led to him imitating another contemporary of his that was incredibly popular at the time, with ideas that were a little more bizarre. That's right, the Nen system is a fusion between Dragon Ball Ki and Jojo stance, and the crazy part is, it totally worked. One of the things people always remark about Hunter x Hunter is that powerful antagonists like Hisoka or Illumi are relevant throughout the entire story. Togashi was refining this new style in Yu Yu Hakusho, but we can already see him experimenting with it by introducing the idea of territories, which are these powerful psychic abilities that trigger with specific conditions, resulting in more strategic battles where, in order to win, the characters needed to outwit their opponents, not just overpower them. And if you haven't seen JoJo's, that's pretty much a stand battle. What sets Nen apart from other magic systems is that Togashi didn't just haphazardly mash it together, like in One Piece or Bleach. In those stories, Haki and spiritual pressures serve as an analog for Ki, while Double Fruits and Bankai are unique abilities that have many creative uses, similar to stands. Unfortunately, these phenomena are never really explained beyond a throwaway line or two. Their implementation comes across as clumsy because we never understand the relationship between them, resulting in world building that kind of feels disjointed. Togashi, however, didn't do this. Instead, he used one magic system to explain the other, and wound up creating something entirely new. That's really the point I'm trying to make. Although Ki and stance already existed beforehand, by writing about what interested him and bringing his own unique perspective into it, Togashi revolutionized an entire genre. It wasn't immediate, of course. Like I said earlier, he was still figuring out the kinks at first, and eventually defaulted back to the Dragon Ball formula for the end of the series, mostly out of desperation. I'll touch on this later, but it's important to keep in mind that the end of Yu Yu Hakusho was really stressful for Togashi. He even suffered multiple health problems because of it. The new style he was trying to develop required a lot of time to pull off well since it's so detail-oriented, which was at odds with the demands of a weekly serialized manga. That doesn't mean it was a waste of time though. This new approach still culminated in a fight so good, Togashi decided to use it again in Hunter x Hunter. Unfortunately, that doesn't really help my case. If anything, it just makes Togashi look even more unoriginal. To make matters worse, there's a significant amount of elements from Yu Yu Hakusho that were recycled in Hunter x Hunter. One of the most obvious ones are the four main characters. You got a stubborn protagonist, a loud mouth with a heart of gold, an analytical pretty boy, and of course, a murderous edgelord that's somehow the most popular character on the roster. I could keep going, but I trust you get what I mean. There's a lot you can find in Hunter x Hunter that isn't exactly original, emerging either from Togashi's body of work or from his influences. And yet, people rarely notice it unless you point it out, or you think way too much about this nerdy crap like I do. While I've never met Togashi, given his writing style, he does strike me as the type of man who would also think way too much about this stuff. Which leads me to believe that, while making Hunter x Hunter, he was keenly aware of what inspired him. And the reason I say this is because of his emphasis on one thing: self-expression. Self-expression is the core of the Nen system. All throughout the story, we see that an individual's mindset and ingenuity is what determines their real strength. This is how Togashi solved the issue of power creep. The more interesting a character, the more powerful they tend to be, which makes it easy for them to reappear later on since they're both strong enough to affect the plot and fascinating enough to excite the audience when they show up. There's also the fact that no two Nen abilities are exactly alike. Even when people have a similar Hatsu, they often have different strengths and weaknesses that arise from what they value. It's also why pro hunters are always these quirky weirdos, because the type of people who pass the exam need to be a little obsessed or crazy to even attempt it, which requires a unique perspective, and their abilities always reflect this. We can even observe it in the audience itself. I have never met a person who watches this anime without wondering what their own Nen ability would be. Some idiots even try to water divination just for fun, like the author of Demon Slayer. Or me. Anyway, my point is that the Nen system is presented in such an alluring way that it invites people to think about their own perspective and how it would manifest in the shape of magical powers. They may not realize it, but they're actually engaging in a form of self-expression when doing this. Even more interesting is the fact that I've never heard anyone wish they had a specific ability from the show. They're certainly inspired by some of the powers, but in my experience, they always add their own twist to it. You know, kinda like Togashi does in his storytelling. It's almost like his philosophy is so ingrained into his work that it subconsciously primes the audience into trying it out themselves. And that's really the secret to originality. The superficial aspects of a story don't have to be that unique as long as the meaning behind it is an authentic expression of the author's inner self. The text even supports my claim. Every Nen user knows how to use the four basic principles, but they always apply them in different ways for varied effects. Also, advanced techniques like Gyo or En emerge from a combination of the four principles, so this process of merging two separate concepts to create something new is literally the foundation of his magic system. And isn't that brilliant? Because if you recall, that's exactly how Togashi created Nen, by mixing Dragon Ball and Jojo's Bizarre Adventure. The fact that this idea of originality is shown to be this powerful really speaks to how important it is to him. This theme goes deeper than that though. Togashi actually had something more to say about self-expression through the character of Crollo Lucifer. Bandit's secret, his ability to steal Hatsus, becomes even more sinister when considered in this context because he's not just taking away people's superpowers, he's taking away the most intimate part of their inner being and exploiting it for his own gain. If that isn't a metaphor for plagiarism, then I don't know what is. The existence of Crollo also feels like Togashi was addressing some of the criticism he faced back when doing Yu Yu Hakusho. When he introduced territories back then, a lot of the fans roasted him for it, claiming he was stealing from Jojo's. Crollo becoming one of the most popular characters in the story while doing something everyone judged Togashi for doing feels like the ultimate vindication of his artistic process. More than that, this ability says so much about the character without directly telling you. Crollo is a man with no identity of his own. He's incapable of creating a unique Hatsu because he doesn't know who he is. The survival of the Phantom Troop matters to him above his own life because the group is the only thing that gives him a sense of self. This makes even more sense after his backstory is revealed, when we find out the Spider started out as a fan-dubbed group of voice actors. Yet again, there's this theme of taking an existing concept and transforming it by adding genuine emotion to it. This also applies to the abilities he takes. Frollo is often shown as a more competent Nen user than the people he steals from, sometimes using their powers more effectively than the owners themselves. He's even at his deadliest when he starts combining them. One of my favorite moments in the story even spells it out for the audience when discussing counterfeiting. During the York New arc, Killua and Gon had been buying anything they could find with aura in order to turn a profit, but someone else was doing that too, and although they won most of the auctions, they lost out on a weird pod they found. Later, after getting to know Sepile, they ask him how much that pod was worth, and he says it's garbage, worth nothing at all, which surprises them. When pressed further, he confesses that he made it himself, but that it wasn't an original creation, a fake. He then goes on to call it a poorly made piece of junk, and then Gon says one of the sweetest thing an artist can ever hear.
Oh.
This is what I've been talking about throughout this whole video. Like, yes, what Sepile did was morally questionable. I'm not gonna sit here and say committing fraud is a good thing. That, however, didn't mean his work had less artistic merit than the real thing. Through passion alone, he managed to imbue the pod with his own essence and made it a work of genius in its own right. I don't blame you if you believe I'm overthinking this, but doesn't that sound like Togashi talking about his relationship to his own art? How he needed to copy others in the beginning out of desperation, and the shame that comes when reflecting on your own work? It's something every creatively inclined person has felt at one point or another, and the message Togashi is sending here is a hopeful one. That as long as you remain true to yourself, your art will always be original because, even when imitating someone else, no one can make it in quite the same way as you. All this talk about fakes and forgeries, however, reminds me of a quote from the Monogatari series that I can never get out of my head.
偽物の方が圧倒的に価値があるってな。そこに本物になろうという意志があるだけ、偽物の方が本物よりも本物だ。
A fake, and its deliberate attempt to be real, can sometimes feel more real than the thing itself. And that, my friends, finally leads me to Meruem, because he's the very embodiment of this sentiment. Hunter x Hunter is largely about Togashi reflecting on his journey as an artist. To understand what I mean, it's important to remember that making Yu Yu Hakusho took a lot out of Togashi, to the point where he suffered multiple health problems near the end. After finishing it, he even claimed he would never draw professional manga ever again, which makes the existence of Hunter x Hunter all the more special to me. This story was only made after he took some time off and thought about what drawing manga meant to him. With this in mind, I find it interesting that after more than a decade of trying out different stuff, the Chimera Ant arc feels like a return to the Dragon Ball style he used to emulate. Only this time Togashi had way more experience under his belt, and it shows. The arc is structured much more like a traditional shonen, with fights becoming way more common here than in any other part of the story, but the transition is so smooth that you never really question it. This is in part because the boys now had a better understanding of Nen after training with Bisky, which meant that they were now ready for actual combat. But wait a second, doesn't this sound familiar? Hunter x Hunter spent the majority of its first half getting you to care about Gon and Killua, only to then switch it up and turn into a more conventional battle manga. Just like Togashi did in Yu Yu Hakusho, and, more importantly, just like Toriyama did in Dragon Ball. When looking at it through this lens, it kind of feels like the entire story had been building up to this.
A big plan? You know that for a fact?
No, but he could have one.
If you don't have anything smart to say, zip it.
Obviously, there were plenty of awesome fights along the way, but Gon and Killua are barely involved in them. The Hunter exam never had any actual fights. Heaven's Arena is closer, but those battles were more determined by the rules rather than strength, making them feel more like a game. And then there was York New, where Gon and Killua are mostly running away from the Phantom Troop. And finally, at the end of Greed Island, the boys finally get into an actual fight, setting things up perfectly for the Chimera Ant arc. What I'm about to say is complete speculation on my part, so please take it with a grain of salt. But I feel like the Chimera Ant arc was Togashi coming to terms with how he ended Yu Yu Hakusho. almost like an analysis of what he went through during that period and what he ultimately learned from it. You see, Togashi's health first started to deteriorate during the Dark Tournament saga. And can you guess what was going on in Dragon Ball at the time? The Cell Saga! All of a sudden, Meruem's resemblance to Cell starts making a little more sense. Chimera Ants are the epitome of what I've been talking about this whole video. A mixture of disparate elements that becomes something greater than the sum of its parts. They're literally an amalgam of the strongest traits of different animals, and Meruem stands at the top of their hierarchy as the pinnacle of this concept. Since Togashi, by his own admission, owes so much of his career to Toriyama, it's only natural that he would pay tribute to Dragon Ball when discussing this idea of creativity. What really makes this work, however, is the fact that Togashi used his admiration to tell a very intimate story, turning Meruem into a way better written character than Cell. This shouldn't be a controversial statement. I know some people like Cell, but to me he's one of the more boring villains in Dragon Ball. He just wanted to defeat the Sea Fighters for shits and giggles, to prove how strong he was. So his motivation for the Cell games comes across as vague and even a little contrived. Furthermore, his ultimate downfall lacks a bit of narrative weight because he doesn't really have an emotional connection to Gohan. Any villain could have been on the receiving end of the father-son Kamehameha, and people would have loved it regardless, because that moment wasn't about Cell, it was about Gohan. Meruem, on the other hand, is regarded as one of the best characters Togashi has ever written. While Cell represents the superficial aspects of a perfect being, Meruem not only does this, but also reflects the psychology of someone who truly believes they are the pinnacle of evolution. His story is a lot more personal because we get to know him from the moment he's born, and see his thought process mature over time until he meets his tragic end. This is in stark contrast to Gon, who went on a downward spiral throughout the Chimera Ant arc, but was ultimately saved. Although they never meet, their journeys perfectly mirror each other, where Meruem started as a monster and gradually became more human, while Gon did the opposite, sacrificing himself for meaningless revenge. The fact that he accomplished this through a power-up transformation, the shonen trope Toriyama innovated, just ties everything up in a neat bow. It also wouldn't surprise me if Gon's self-destructive attitude is similar to how Togashi behaved when working on Yu Yu Hakusho. And to be completely honest, I'm ashamed to say that I know the feeling too. It's something I keep having to learn over and over again. Then again, maybe I'm just projecting my feelings here. It's completely possible that Togashi would just shrug at what I'm saying and reply, "It's just a manga, bro." But I really doubt that. This toxic mindset of neglecting your health and hurting the people around you to accomplish a foolish goal wouldn't hit so hard if he hadn't gone through that hell himself. And that makes Hunter x Hunter incredibly meaningful to me. It's funny because when you sit down and think about it, the story's message is one most people would call generic. That when following your dreams, the friends you make along the way are what's ultimately important. And yet, a lot of people consider it very profound. Not everyone, though. There's always going to be someone who calls it unoriginal, but in a way I find that really liberating. A lot of people feel like they're not special, or unique enough to say anything that matters, and they really shouldn't be worried about it. This doesn't just apply to art or storytelling, it applies to life in general. You could be a genius on par with Togashi, and there will still be a pathetic jackass that sneers at you. So just do your own thing, even if it's been done before. That's how you discover the things that matter most about what you love. I didn't even realize how much this story had influenced me until I started writing this essay. The idea of mixing everything you love to make something new is also at the core of my book, Shotgun Fantasy, where I combine Western fantasy like Lord of the Rings with shonen battle anime. If that sounds interesting to you, there's a link in the description and a pinned comment. I guarantee you it'll be the best story you read this year, or your money back. Because it's free. Also, if you want more analysis from me, check out my Attack on Titan video on how it challenges morality. Thanks for watching, and don't be afraid to be original.